continue through us.
Beautiful, Judith. Thank you.
Thank
And what a great start for a beautiful program. So I'm going to now invite Marc. I want to give you a little bit of background on Marc, and then we'll take it away with Marc's presentation. And Marc Stevens was born in Toronto and is the author of Escape, Evasion, and Revenge. As a German living in London at the outbreak of the war, Marc's father committed identity theft to enlist in the RAF Air Force and was the object of the Metropolitan Police manhunt as a potential enemy spy. After locating and finally obtaining access to the Home Office file marked secret, sealed until 2051, Marc decided that a book would have to be written, and so what followed was Escape, Evasion, and Revenge, the true story of a German Jewish RAF pilot who bombed Berlin and became a POW. Neither Marc nor anyone else in his immediate family had known of his father's Jewish origins. So let me just get your PowerPoint set up, Marc, and I'll be ready to go.
Thanks very much for the invitation, by the way, Jeffery. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Okay, let's start. All right, go ahead, Marc.
Okay, if you want to flip to the next slide, please. Again, I grew up not knowing that my father was born Jewish. I had been told as a young boy that he was originally German, but I was also sworn to secrecy because that was a deep, dark family secret, and I wasn't allowed to tell anyone. The first time I ever told anyone was when I was about to be married at age 39 for the first time. And I told my wife to be. So my father's story is somewhat long and complicated. I'll try and boil it down to the essentials. He came from a relatively well-off family and successful family in Hanover, Germany. But his father died in 1926 when he was just 6 years old. And his mother immediately sent him away to boarding school while retaining her other two children, his older brother and his younger sister at home with her. So that fostered a deep resentment in my father towards his mother, which lasted sadly for the rest of his life. I guess next slide, please, Jeffrey. The family, my grandmother kept the family business going, but wasn't an expert in business by any stretch of the imagination. She herself was a concert pianist. And so didn't really have any expertise in business. Nonetheless, her brother was the director of a bank, so he helped out as much as he could. But of course, when the Nazis came to power in 32, 33, that started the rest of the decline of the family's fortunes, at least financially. Immediately in 1933, after Hitler came to power, my uncle, my father's older brother, who was just 17 at the time and the de facto man of the house, decided that the family really needed to move to England, and he went off on his own to London to pave the way. The following year, in early 1934, at age 14, my father followed him, and their little sister, who was only a year younger than my dad, but was still far too young to go live in England without parental supervision, was sent off to finishing school in Switzerland, which would allow her to obtain the appropriate educational qualifications to be able to apply successfully for a visa to enter England. And she did so in 1938. But their mother, my grandmother, had to stay behind in Germany because she had already spent everything she could on getting her three children to safety. And of course, the Nazi Party instituted financial penalties on all Jewish business owners to the point where there was virtually nothing left by 1938 or 39. So my grandmother put together all the money she could scrape together legally and sent it to England to care for her 3 children there. My father, again, because of his resentment against his mother, immediately got his hands on all of the money without sharing it with his 2 siblings and deliberately gambled it away. Very sad situation. He then resorted to petty crime to support himself over 1939 and was arrested in the summer of 39 and sentenced to 3 months for petty theft. Interestingly enough, next slide, please. On September 1st, the day the Nazis invaded Poland, all of the prisoners or enemy alien prisoners, excuse me, or people who, let's put it this way, people who had short times left on their sentences, who were not deemed a threat to society, were released from prison because the authorities knew that they would need to make room in British prisons to arrest German citizens who were in England for various reasons. They didn't want them acting as spies. Now, oddly enough, one of the people that they released on September 1st, 1939 was my father, who was in fact one of those enemy aliens. Next slide, please, Jeff. That they would have arrested and interned for the duration of the war in any case. So it seems very odd that they let him out. He was still going by his German name, which was Georg Hein. And the day after this, he was, oh, by the way, he was given a train ticket back to London and was told by the police to report to the police station in London when he got there, and they would know what to do with him. He, of course, took the train. He did take the train back to London, but did not report to a police station because he didn't want to spend the next 5 or 6 years in jail. He did, of course, nobody knew how long the war would last, but everybody knew there was going to be a war. So what he did is he went to a cemetery where was buried a schoolmate of his who had died. My father had finished his schooling in London after he'd been sent there as a 14-year-old. He'd finished high school and then had done 1 year at the London School of Economics. And while he was a student at the high school, one of his schoolmates had died and the entire school had attended the funeral, so he knew where this boy was buried. So he went to the cemetery, wrote down the details of this boy's life, mainly his birth date, went to a government office and applied for a copy of his birth certificate, meaning that my father was presenting himself to be this particular boy. He did obtain the birth certificate, and the very next day when Britain declared war on Germany, September 3rd of 1939, he enlisted in the Royal Air Force under the name of the dead boy, Peter Stevens. So he trained to become a pilot from 1939 to 41, started flying bomber missions in April of 1941, and flew 22 combat missions between the time that he started flying combat and the date September 7th, 1941, which was his first mission detailed to bomb Berlin, which of course was the most heavily defended target in the Third Reich. While he was over Berlin, he had just dropped his bombs and his aircraft was badly rocked by flak explosions nearby, which tore holes in both of his wings, which meant both of his fuel tanks. Knowing that the airplane might explode at any time from leaking fuel and not wanting to endanger the lives of his 3 crewmen, he ordered them to bail out. Sadly, while 2 of them did, sadly, one of them was never again seen alive, and that 19-year-old boy is today, his body was never identified, and he is listed on the wall of British or Royal Air Force deaths with no known graves, just outside of London today. So my father found that the airplane was still flyable, but he didn't want to take a chance with his crew. So again, he ordered them to bail out. But when he did, he noticed that because the airplane was still flyable, he figured he might as well head as far west as he could get on what little remaining fuel he had. And he was able to make it as far west as Amsterdam, amazingly enough, before he ran out of fuel on one engine. I figured he had about 10 minutes fuel left on the other engine and put the airplane down in a farmer's field just outside of Amsterdam. Next slide, please, Jeffrey. So he went on the run. He destroyed all of the secret bits left in the airplane after he landed in the field, set fire to the airplane, and together with his navigator, who had decided he'd rather stay with the airplane than bail out, they went on the run, and unfortunately they were captured by Nazi troops who were searching for him about 12 hours later. So this began the 3 years and 8 months of my father's captivity under the Nazis, which of course was entirely without any protection whatsoever under the Geneva Convention, because he was still, at least in his own eyes, a German citizen. Had the Nazis ever found out his true identity during the 3 years and 8 months that he was a prisoner, of course they legally would have been able to execute him. And the British could have done nothing about it. They would have had no say in the matter. So he was taken to various prisoner of war camps, and early on he decided that he really wanted to escape. And of course he had a huge advantage in that he was a German. He knew the language perfectly. He knew the mannerisms. He knew everything about the German people and how to behave properly. So he immediately started to make plans to escape. And just a month after he was captured, he was en route. He was being moved from one prison camp to another on a prison train with 1,000 other prisoners. And just as people were getting ready to bed down for the night, the train slowed slightly to take a curve in the tracks. And he unscrewed the grill off a ventilator shaft and jumped out of the moving train. Unfortunately, other people in the train, in other cars, had exactly the same idea at the same time. One of them jumped out and landed on an air hose connection for the emergency brakes, broke the connection, and whenever the connection on the emergency brake cable was broken, the brakes came on automatically. So the guards, sensing that something was strange or something was unusual, opened up all of the doors on the train and saw my father running for the woods nearby and started taking pot shots at him. I later learned from another prisoner who was had jumped out the ventilator shaft at the same time as my father, that he literally said there were bullets buzzing by his ears, sounding like bees. But they were able to make it successfully to the woods and hide while there was a perfunctory search performed by the German guards. The train buttoned back up and headed off on its way again, leaving my father and this other prisoner pilot, a Canadian pilot, as a matter of fact, somebody I got to know and who later contributed the foreword to my book. They went off together, and my father made it a plan with the acceptance of the other Canadian pilot to go to my grandmother's home, where she still lived in Hanover. At least my father believed he still lived there. She still lived there in Hanover, to get food, money, and civilian clothing to enable them to head further south towards neutral Switzerland. So they slept by day and moved by night. They hitched a ride like hobos on a freight train, eventually made it to Hanover, and were literally walking through downtown Hanover in their British and Canadian Air Force uniforms in broad daylight, which still boggles my mind today, thinking about it. They got to my grandmother's home. The Canadian pilot hid while my father knocked on the door. Somebody he didn't recognize answered the door, and he asked to speak with Frau Hein, his mother, and was greeted with a reaction that he had not expected, or came as quite a shock. That, oh, what do you mean? Frau Hein committed suicide 6 weeks before the war started. Didn't you know? He did not know, obviously, because of his legal troubles and his resentment towards her. He had lost all contact with her, and was obviously quite taken aback to learn of his mother's suicide some 2 years earlier. Nonetheless, he gathered his wits about him and went off to visit an aunt and uncle who also lived in Hanover nearby, and was successful in getting food, money, and civilian clothing. Hitched a ride on a train, actually bought train tickets on a train heading south towards Switzerland, but they were smart. They bought tickets on what we call the milk run, the slow train, heading south because they surmised correctly, as it turns out, that the Gestapo would be checking identity cards on all of the fast trains. And they were not doing so on the slow trains. So they made it as far as Frankfurt. They got in late at night and realized soon afterwards that the next train heading further south towards the Swiss border did not leave until the next morning, so they had to find a place to sleep. They saw that other people were bedded down for the night in the one of the waiting rooms, and so decided to do that themselves. Unfortunately, they did not know that the waiting room would be inspected by the railway police in the middle of the night with an identity check, and so they were caught and captured there. Had to give themselves up because they had not had any time to arrange for false ID papers. So they were sent back to another prisoner of war camp. Next slide, please, Jeffrey. Once my father decided that he came up with another plan, and that was to get himself dressed up in a false German guard uniform and march a party of 10 prisoners out the front gate of the camp. And he almost succeeded. He got about 100 meters outside or 100 yards outside the camp, and the guard who had led him out the front gate blew his whistle and motioned for him to come back. Now, my father was just carrying, instead of a real rifle, of course, he was just carrying a wooden block that had been carved in the appearance of a German rifle. And whereas all the guards in the camp nearby had real weapons and real bullets in their weapons, so he decided discretion was the better part of valor, turned the group around and marched back to the camp to find out what the problem was. And the real guard came clean with my father and said that he was in big trouble because my father's gate pass was missing the signature of the officer of the day. And could my father please go back and get that signature and save this poor guard a lot of grief later on? Well, my father, happy to oblige, marched the group back into the camp, but of course had no idea who the officer of the day was, and so was unable to forge the correct signature. So they realized they'd come so close to success that they had to try this again. They waited a couple of weeks for things to die down. And again, 2 weeks later, this would have been the middle of December of 1941. Dad got dressed up in his fake German guard uniform again, carrying his carved block of wood to resemble a German rifle, marched the same party of prisoners out to the front gate, but this time it was a different guard, and he was very suspicious immediately. Perhaps he'd been warned by the first guard that prisoners were likely to try this ruse. And so he insisted on seeing my father's paybook. My father claimed he didn't have his paybook with him, that he didn't carry it. Within 24 hours a day, he'd left it back in his barracks. And while they were arguing over this point, the guard was getting increasingly distressed, and the prisoners themselves were getting nervous. So they decided to disperse on their own. And the guard immediately started panicking and turned to my father and said, screamed at him, in fact, "What are you doing just standing there? Arrest them all." In other words, the true German guard had no idea that my father was not himself a German guard. So my father immediately went running back into the camp, trying to round these people up, and that was the end of that attempt, sadly. But Dad was successful in another escape attempt a year or two later, year and a half later, I guess, in March of 1943. A small group of prisoners had dug a tunnel out of a Polish prisoner of war camp where they were being kept through the latrine, which, if you can imagine, that was not only ingenious, but also very unpleasant to dig a tunnel out of the cesspit under a group latrine, which is why the tunnel was never discovered. It was simply ingenious. One of the best escape plans of the war. It was successful, but unfortunately, nobody ever heard about it. Nobody's ever written a book about that particular escape, although I understand from my research that some people are talking about the possibility of writing a book about it. In any case, what happened was my father got away. He was dressed he had the full fake civilian clothing. He had a full set of false identity papers, making him out to be a civilian business traveler, was wearing a beautifully tailored suit, took trains heading, again, the idea was to get towards Switzerland and get back to neutral territory. Unfortunately, he was caught up in an identity check on a fast train this time in nearing Hanover or Cologne. There's some difference in the paperwork about that. And he was taken to Gestapo headquarters and was interrogated for several days, which cannot have been a pleasant experience, of course, and had to come clean eventually, saying that he was an escaped British prisoner. And luckily, the prisoner of war camp sent guards to retrieve him when they heard that he'd been captured by the Gestapo. So he was able to get liberated back to the custody of the Luftwaffe, who were running the Air Force prisoner of war camps. He was then sent to Stalag Luft 3, which you might recognize as the home of what we call today the Great Escape. You've probably all seen the fabulous movie from 1963 starring Steve McQueen and James Garner and Richard Attenborough and a host of other big stars of the day. Fabulous movie based on a true story. Because it was made in Hollywood, however, or by Hollywood, a lot of liberties were taken with the true story. Next slide, please, Jeffrey. And my father, luckily for him and luckily for me, was being held in the same camp, but in a different part of the camp. The camp was divided up into about 7 different compounds, each compound holding about 1,000 prisoners. My father was, when he first arrived at that camp, he was offered the position on the executive of the escape organization responsible for scrounging. So if you've seen the movie The Great Escape, you'll recognize the character of James Garner, who played the famous scrounger in the camp. That was actually it wasn't one real person, it was a composite of several people, one of whom was my father. But again, luckily, my father was in a different part of the camp. And the reason I say luckily is because as a native German speaker, he would have been one of the first 10 people out of the tunnel. He almost certainly would have been recaptured, because in reality, what happened was 76 people escaped through that tunnel. 73 were recaptured, meaning that 3 actually did make it back as far as England. But of the 76 who were recaptured, Hitler ordered 50 of them to be murdered in cold blood. So undoubtedly, my father would have been one of the people who escaped through the tunnel. He would have been recaptured, very likely, and he would have been murdered. So I wouldn't be here today talking to you. So again, luckily for me, he was in a different part of the camp, but again, was an executive member of the escape organization and played a behind-the-scenes role in at least 1 or 2 other very successful escapes that took place from his part of the camp. One of which was called the Wooden Horse Escape. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but a group of prisoners used some old wood from some Red Cross parcels they'd received, built a vaulting horse, and while they were making a show of doing exercise on a daily basis, jumping over the vaulting horse, 2 people were hidden inside the vaulting horse and were digging a tunnel out of the camp. 3 people escaped through that tunnel, and all 3 of them made it back to England. So after the Great Escape, which happened in March of 1944, orders came through from London over the camp's secret radio, which my father was the custodian of, and the prisoners were ordered not to attempt any more escapes, because at that point it was clear that D-Day was very close by. That Germany was losing the war at this point, and that the prisoners would be much safer if they just hunkered down and stayed where they were and waited for the war to end. So that's essentially what happened in January of 1945, which is 3.5, 4 months before the end of the war. Germany was literally falling apart, and logistics were non-existent, so food supplies dwindled completely. My father had lost about 20 pounds during his 3.5 years of captivity up till that point. And then all of the prisoners in Polish camps were moved westward by a combination of marching and trains through what was essentially the worst winter in 100 years in that part of Europe. They were moved westward back to central Germany, and my father ended up in a prisoner of war camp just outside Berlin, as a matter of fact, where he was later liberated by Russian troops at the end of April. But in the last 3 months of the war, during that period, he lost a further 20 to 30 pounds because there just was no food at all. The Germans were in such disarray that that nobody had any food left, certainly not for prisoners of war. So my father was liberated in the end of April 1945, and to do a fast forward, I guess, to try and keep this as short as possible. Dad stayed in the Royal Air Force for 2 years after the war. He was awarded the second highest British Medal for Bravery. He was one of only 69 members of the Royal Air Force to receive that medal. It's called the Military Cross. I knew that my father had that medal from a very young age. I knew that, but I had no idea, A, of the significance, and B, of the rarity. And then my father died in 1979 when I was 22 years old. And about 8 or 10 years later, I decided to try and do some research and discover for what my father had been awarded this, specifically what he had done to be awarded this very unusual and rare medal for bravery. And so that began an odyssey of 18 years of research, with me traveling following in his footsteps all through Europe and England, making many trips to the National Archives in London, digging out again a file that finally, after about 15 years of research, finding this file on my father that was marked secret and was sealed until the year 2051. I was able to get that file opened in 2006 through a Freedom of Information Act application, and discovered this whole amazing story about my father's life, and the fact that he had been born a German Jew, of which I had no knowledge. I later tracked down his little sister, who was the only living family member left in England, and she confirmed details of the family's history. Interestingly enough, my older brother had met and married a Jewish woman in Philadelphia, and had later converted to Judaism himself, not knowing that our father was born Jewish. Both my brother's children were raised Jewish, and today they both live happily as adults in Israel, and each one of them now has a child who was born in Israel. So I think my father might be smiling down on them from somewhere, wherever he is. And that's the story of the only German Jewish bomber pilot in the Royal Air Force in World War II.
Wow.
If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to take them.
Wow.
Well, I'm going to stop the screen share. We're going to take the questions at the end of the program, but certainly
Okay.
I want to step in and say, I've put together many programs for our group, but this was an exceptional presentation and something different than we normally hear, because we usually have many programs following a similar theme. And I'm so happy to have met you through the Facebook group and to have heard about your story. And I would recommend that please mention the book. So if anybody wants to read the book, if you can just mention the title so we can say it.
Sure, it's called Escape, Evasion, and Revenge. And last year, the Guardian newspaper in London, England, named it as the 5th best book ever written about the topic of revenge. Ahead of the Bible, in fact, which really blew my mind.
Very good. All right.
And it's available on Amazon and from the publisher in England.
So I would want you to go take a look at the chat when you have some time. There's some beautiful comments for you in chat, and I'm going to turn the program back over to Judith for another one of Judith's lovely songs. And then after Judith sings, we'll hear David's story. So Judith, take it away. Tell us a little bit about why you chose this next song.
Okay, next song. On November 2nd was the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. Also, my parents' wedding anniversary was on that date. But significantly, you probably know the story about the Balfour Declaration. Well, my mother was born in Chelm. And in Chelm, the Hasidim there, Chelm is actually the birthplace of Hasidism. The Hasidim there sang a song in Yiddish about the betrayal of the Balfour Declaration, how the Jews were betrayed by England. It's interesting because your father served for the English, but it's complicated, very, very complicated. So I'm going to play the song right now. It's self-explanatory, tells the story. If you go to YouTube and you look at the video, you will see the pictures, all of the pictures of how the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem joined forces with Hitler. And it's all there. You can see him meeting with Hitler. You can see him inspecting the troops, everything, to exterminate the Jewish people across the entire world, and of course, including the Mideast. And so what happened after the Balfour Declaration, there's a map that you can see how Israel looked. It looked nothing like it looks today. It was designated to be a country. It was much bigger and went all the way into what you would say now is Jordan. But and England at that time was dividing up the Middle East. They controlled it. They created all of this, and then they betrayed everything. So this is a song in honor of, well, the Jewish people and everything that we've had to go through to finally get Israel. So I'm going to play this now.
Thank you, Judith. And I mentioned earlier that Judith and I did a wonderful Obligations of Memory interview series of 5 episodes. So people who want to know more, much more about Judith and Judith's parents and her mother's work in the Yiddish theater in Lodz would be well interested to go to the YouTube channel and look for Judith's picture, and you'll see the episodes. And now I want to bring forward David Tabatsky and tell you a little bit about David. So,
Can I just say, somebody wrote in the chat, yes, I'm just mouthing along with the song. I'm not singing because
Okay.
the song, it's pre-recorded and it's beautifully arranged. We put a lot of hard work into it. So I want everyone to hear the song with the arrangement, but I'm just, if you see me not really singing, I'm just getting, I'm with it. I'm with the song.
You're into it.
I'm into it.
All right. So David is the author of The Boy Behind the Door, How Solomon Kuhl Escaped the Nazis. And it's inspired by the true story of Solomon Kuhl, the youngest member of his Amsterdam family, who managed to flee the Nazis throughout World War II, while the Netherlands was occupied. David was fortunate to meet Sal, who guided him through Amsterdam and his tale of survival. David says it's not easy to find Holocaust literature that can captivate young, educated readers, especially boys. David's book is told through the eyes of a Jewish teenager in Holland from 1940 to 1945, and it's appealing and accessible to all emerging young adults. Michael Birnbaum, the director of Holocaust Institute of the American Jewish University in LA, says it's a powerful story powerfully told. And with that, I want to welcome David to our program. And David, I'm going to get your PowerPoint set up. So give me a second. And I'm working on this in a sec right here. Give me 1 second. So go ahead, David.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for having me. I'm in quite good company today, and I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of this story with you today. Just a little bit about myself for context, because I think it's always important to connect, especially in this case, the storyteller with the story. My father was a World War II veteran. I grew up in a Jewish home. My father, as I said before, was a professional cantor. He was the first graduating class of the Cantors Institute, which was part of the Jewish Theological Seminary. It was training cantors in the conservative movement. So I grew up with a very strong Jewish identity. You kind of only find out later in life how some of that is somewhat distorted and mythological, but it's still very penetrating as well. My grandparents have their own stories connected to the Holocaust. My grandfather, who was born in Lithuania, lost quite a few members of his family. My grandfather, on my father's side, escaped the pogroms in Ukraine in the early part of the 20th century and ended up living in America, where my father was born. I also had an experience as a young child going to Camp Ramah, which is a very famous camp. I think any of you who might know about the conservative movement, especially in America. And in this camp, when I was 11 years old, it was my first summer there. In August, I think it was commemorating with a holiday, was it Tu B'Shvat, I think, where they showed the film Let My People Go, which was a black and white documentary of the war, a full-length hour-plus film with extremely graphic, very realistic images, documentation of the war. And I remember as a child sort of wanting to raise my hand and say, like when you say in a classroom, can I go to the bathroom? I wanted to say, hey, we're only 11, stop. You know, it was clear that there was a big story here and a whole lot to unfold. And gradually, as I grew older, I investigated it more. And I think there was a flashback for me as a child in synagogue, in the shul. Well, every Shabbos, every holiday, I mean, you name it, I was there as the son of a cantor. And as a young child, I remember seeing at eye level the numbers on a few people's arms. And I obviously was curious about it. It didn't look like a normal thing. And this was also in the days before tattoos just in general were so popular as they are now. And so they really stuck out, and I wasn't really understanding the context of it as a 4 or 5-year-old, certainly, but the image emotionally stuck with me, and obviously is still imprinted in the DNA of who I am. I was also in Amsterdam in 1987 in a former career when I was working as a performing artist. And so I was there many years before I ended up meeting Solomon Kuhl. And I also was in Germany in the early 80s, which was the first time. And I had some pretty penetrating experiences as an American Jew being in Germany for the first time. It was very graphic for me. All these memories that stored up since my childhood played a role in me finally telling a story on my own. Of course, not my own story, but I had to find a way as a writer, as a storyteller, to make it my own, because that's our obligation, especially with a story as delicate and sensitive as this, to invest yourself 100%, because really it's the only way to tell that story. So you have to create your own vulnerability to understand the extreme trauma and vulnerability of the people who experience this. That's, to me, the obligation of any writer. And as a person of Jewish identity, I think I might have felt that even stronger with this particular subject matter. And I felt obligated also to make Sal's story resonate for young readers, because all along that was my goal ever since I got brought into the project, was to educate new generations of young readers. There was also a little bit of a coincidence. May 5th, 1940 was Sal's birthday. And this was also the same day that I ended up later in my own life marrying a German woman. And May 10th, 1940, which was the date of Sal's bar mitzvah, was also the same day my son was born. So these were personal connections that, well, they're a little bit abstract, they're a little bit superficial, but in the total picture, they put me in a deep position to begin to tell this story. And going back to the idea of young people and the idea of educating them, we often hear the Holocaust referred to as unthinkable, quote unquote, as unthinkable. But in my opinion, I feel we must make it thinkable. We must make it accessible. This is the obligation also of good storytelling, which became my job with this book. And personally, as I said, with my own memory banks, I brought that emotion with me as I remained faithful to the story, of course, but also injecting it with as much humanity and relevance as I could for young readers today. So how did this even happen? Well, there's a man named Sandy Batkin. He was a real estate businessman in Scarsdale, New York, which is a suburb here of New York City, pretty wealthy area with a high Jewish concentration. And Sandy was on holiday with his wife in Aruba, which is a small Dutch colony in the Caribbean. And Solomon Kuhl, with his wife Nettie, coincidentally was there also. This was in the early 1960s. And they're standing in the ocean, two men in their bathing suits, enjoying a nice sunny day. Who are you? Who are you? Chat, 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 blah, blah, blah. So I'm a businessman from New York City. I'm a big supporter of Israel, da, da, da. What's your story? Well, Saul reluctantly ended up telling him just a little bit about his experience as a Holocaust survivor, which flabbergasted Sandy. He knew, of course, he was intellectually, cognizant of all of it. He knew things factually, but he had never met someone viscerally who was a Holocaust survivor, to see him as a human being standing in the ocean the same way. We're the same people. This really struck him, and he tried to encourage Sandy to tell his story. Saul was reluctant. He told Sandy, well, I'm just a normal guy from Amsterdam. This isn't really something I want to relive anymore. He was typically, as many, dealing with survivor's guilt still 15, 20 years later. And in fact, I found out all through the rest of his life until he was an old man. But anyway, their friendship continued and they took some more holidays together over the years. And finally, Saul said, yeah, I think you're right. I should tell my story. I don't know how to do it. I have no idea. This is not who I am, as I'm not a storyteller. But I think for my children and my grandchildren, I feel like I should do it. So Sandy, back here in New York, he happened to meet a literary agent who I knew, who I had done some work with, and she put the two of us together. So Sandy ended up commissioning me to go to Amsterdam and to meet Saul and try to see if I could, create a book. So I did that. I went to Amsterdam. This is quite a few years ago. And I spent a week with Saul and his wife, Nettie. And Saul took me around through the streets of Amsterdam. He showed me where he had grown up as a child, where he went to school. In fact, one of the schools where they had to escape out the windows when the Germans were not marching up the hallways, where they had to shimmy out through one of the small windows, and the apartment houses where they kind of ran and hid and eventually got away. And then in the area, which was known kind of as the Jewish Quarter, the most concentrated area of Jewish business and Jewish culture, where you'll see in these photos of Amsterdam, the picture of the Jewish theater, which was a monumental institution in Amsterdam at that time. They had a very big Jewish population. It was very active in theater and music. And I would say, I guess, the deepest level of cynicism and violence and perversity. This is where the Nazis decided to set up the deportation center for the Jews of Amsterdam, which was inside the Jewish theater of the city. And so we traveled around the city and saw all that. Saul shared as much as he could remember. Later on, when I wrote the book, there were obviously a lot of gaps, a lot of research that needed to be done to fill everything in, to remain as faithful as possible to the actual lineage of it all, to the actual archival facts and figures. Those are all as authentic as humanly possible. In fact, Michael Berenbaum, who was cited earlier by Jeffrey, who also was one of the founders of the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Michael, who I've known since I was a kid, he actually was at Camp Rama, was a counselor when I was there. So I know him a long, long time. He ended up marrying the older sister of a very dear friend of mine, who I grew up with. So there's a long time connection with him. Michael corrected two tiny little points, the name of a street, and I think it was another reference I can't remember when he read through the book. So I passed the test. If Michael Berenbaum says things are accurate, you sort of have the seal of approval when it comes to Holocaust literature, especially in English. And also my publisher, Amsterdam Publishers, which is located in Amsterdam, coincidentally. The publisher corrected me also on a spelling of a street that I had wrong. I think there was one or two letters were wrong. Otherwise, everything was vetted very, very carefully. But to create an active life, especially for one of a boy, the book opens when Saul is 12 years old, just a little bit before his bar mitzvah. And what is Saul doing? Well, he's doing what any other 12-year-old kid in any Western society would do. He likes to play with his friends. He was big on bicycles. He was the youngest, so he got a lot of hand-me-downs. He had two older brothers and an older sister. And so when he finally got a bicycle of his own, all he wanted to do was ride it all around the city, get his mother's permission when he could leave the neighborhood, when he could venture out miles away and go through Vondel Park, when he could go beyond Vondel Park and ride all the way out of Amsterdam with his brother 40 miles away, which now we think, oh my God, how could you let your child go 40 miles away? You better call Child and Family Services. But in Amsterdam, in the late 30s, 1940, there was no reason to be afraid. No parent would ever think twice, oh, my kid, he's going to ride a walk. I'm not going to know where he is for the next several hours. That's fine. Well, they did do that, and they ended up in Eindhoven, 40 miles away, at a friend, actually, of their families. And so this was just the normal life they were living, just like any 12-year-old kid. They really didn't have a care in the world until things kind of turned upside down. So let me just read something to you. This is from an early chapter in the book. When we've met Saul, we know who he is. Like I said, we know he's just a normal, fun-loving 12-year-old. He has his little repartee with his mother. He has a brooding father, and he's got 3 older siblings. It was May 5th, 1940, and I was now 13 years old. In the Netherlands, birthdays are major events, and if anyone forgets, it's a big fat blunder. My mother made sure everyone was there, aunts, uncles, cousins, family, friends, and most important, Louis and Daniel, and of course, Tinny, doting on me as only an older sister can. Take your time, little brother, she whispered. It's your choice. Make a wish, Saul, come on. Both of my brothers wrapped their arms around me, pressing me against the table where the cake was on display. I closed my eyes and prepared to blow out the candles. A slight smile must have been visible on my face, and Daniel wasted no time noticing. What's her name, Sal? Ah, forget it, kid, said Louis. If you have to wish for a girlfriend, it'll never happen. Leave him alone, boys, said Tinny. Saul can have any girl he wants. I loved my sister. But in that moment, my mind was far away from any thoughts of girls. I was wishing for one thing and one thing only, that every birthday I would ever have would be celebrated with all these people together as one big family. As I blew out the flames and the house became totally dark for an instant, everyone cheered and applauded for me. They were happy to have a reason to assemble in our house and celebrate a joyous occasion. Even my father, when he could tear himself away from the radio, was part of the festivities. Hitler's army had invaded Poland just 8 months earlier, and he had promised he would not invade the Netherlands. What did he want with us anyway? But just 1 month ago, Denmark and Norway had succumbed to the Germans. The governments of Belgium and England had warned our government that the Nazis would storm all 3 countries. Mussolini and Hitler had recently formed an alliance, pitting the armies of Germany and Italy against those of France and Britain. All the grown-ups talked about was the impending war. During the past 2 weeks, the Dutch government had proclaimed martial law throughout the country. Local police were arresting members of the Dutch Nazi Party. And just days ago, 21 prominent Nazi sympathizers had been arrested and jailed. Why was everyone so upset? The Nazis couldn't just march in and take over whenever they wanted. The Dutch would never stand for that. We were a peace-loving people. We knew that Europe was falling apart, though. Even a kid my age could see that. My father found it increasingly difficult to enjoy family things like birthdays, especially mine, in my bar mitzvah year. I knew that he loved me and all of us, but he hated the escalating war that seemed to be growing closer and closer to home. We were barely finished eating my birthday cake when he burst into the room, paler than I'd ever seen him, staring at us like we were strangers on the street and not his beloved family. What is it, Papa? The Norwegian government has escaped from Oslo and taken exile in London. I just heard it on the radio. Suddenly, the party was over and our guests left. Which country would be next to fall to the Germans? The next day, my mother called me from the kitchen. I was in the sitting room working hard. Sal, there's so much to do with your bar mitzvah tomorrow. Exactly. I have a lot to study, so I need to do it correctly. Leave me alone. Oh, I'm sure you'll do fine. Listen to me. Louis is busy playing football. Daniel and Tinny are at work, and your father, God bless him, he can't pull himself away from the radio. I protested, but no luck. I want you to go across the street to the Cliverts and ask Frank's mother if I can borrow her good lace tablecloth. Now? You need to know that right now? What? You should go Saturday morning before we go to the synagogue? She was trying to tease me. Sal, do it now, please. But why can't Papa go? He loves talking with Mr. Clivert about all this war stuff. They can go on and on for hours. Come on, Mama, let Papa go. He'll be happy to go instead of me. Just then, my father walked into the kitchen, stiffly, looking like a ghost. His face was frozen and gray like he was hypnotized. He stopped in the doorway as if someone else was controlling his legs, He didn't say a word. He didn't even look like a human being who could speak. He stared straight ahead at my mother, turned like a robot, and stared at me. Philip! Mama was shocked at my father's appearance. Oh my God, what is it? My father didn't move. What's wrong? My father said nothing and gazed blankly across the room. Philip, my darling, what is it? Papa, say something. I stepped across the kitchen floor to him. Papa, you're scaring Mama and me too. He nodded his head back and forth. I once saw a man have a seizure in the marketplace, and he did the same thing, rocking back and forth before he started to shake violently and collapse to the ground. I was afraid the same thing could be happening to my father right there in our kitchen. I hoped he still knew me, standing there before him. I took his hand. He looked down at me, swallowed hard, and lifted his eyes to the ceiling. It's over. Philip, what are you saying? What's over? What do you mean, Papa? It's over. They've crossed the river. What are you talking about? They've crossed the river and there's no turning back. Mama looked down as if she knew the answer. My father didn't speak. Mama, who crossed the river? What river? Philip, tell him. My father took a long, slow breath, as if he were trying to breathe life back into himself after it had been taken away. He stood unsteadily, holding onto the table like his legs might give away any second. Hitler. He looked so pained, saying that name out loud in front of us, as if he were violating our home by uttering that sound from his lips. Adolf Hitler sent the German army across the Dutch border at the Waal River at 5:30 this morning, and they are now marching toward Amsterdam. Oh my God, my mother looked shocked like I'd never seen her. They're 40 miles away. What can we do? All I could think of was Louis and I riding our bikes last year all the way to Eindhoven. That was 40 miles away. We were kids. If we could ride that far in one day, what could the German army do marching with tanks? What can we do? I don't know, Rachel. I don't know. I don't know anything right now. We just have to wait and see, right, Papa? I hope my question sounded normal, because in that moment, I felt desperate to make the German invasion seem like a problem we could fix, if only we could put our minds to it. Yes, Sal, we can only wait and see what will happen. My father turned and left the kitchen without saying another word. It was as if a judge had appeared out of nowhere in our house and ordered my father to be sent away to prison, or worse, to be put to death, and no words could change the verdict. My mother and I looked at each other, unsure what to do. We both realized that my father would be sequestered in the bedroom, keeping his ears glued to the radio, and that if anything new should develop, we would be the first to hear about it. All right then, Sal, I want you to go now and ask Mrs. Clivert about her tablecloth. She was doing her best to put everything back to normal. Are you kidding me, Mama? No, I am not, absolutely not doing anything of the sort. Hitler is 40 miles away, and while that may seem to be very close, meanwhile, life goes on here at home, and boys will have their bar mitzvah, and tablecloths need to be borrowed, so just go across the street and take care of this like I asked you. Well, I slipped on my shoes and left the apartment. Going downstairs, I couldn't get the picture of my father's ashen face out of my mind. Who even said the German army wants to come all the way to Amsterdam? Maybe they'll just stay in the south and relax by the river. But then again, maybe they won't. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I imagined what it would be like if German tanks were rolling down the street. The thought made me shudder and hurry to see Frank. Surely his mother, who was a great cook, would have something sweet baking in the kitchen, and we could all have a good snack and think of better things like tablecloths and bar mitzvahs. But the mood inside the Cliverts' home wasn't any better. They had heard the news on the radio too, like most everybody in the city. Frank and his mother were quietly talking when I knocked on their door. I arranged to borrow the tablecloth, thanked Mrs. Clivert, and returned home without so much as a single sweet. Things had to be pretty bad if Mrs. Clivert wasn't handing out her famous cookies. After a year of dreading the inevitable, but mostly never imagining that such a bad dream could come true, it had finally happened. On Friday, May 10th, 1940, Germany invaded our country just one day before my bar mitzvah. Nazi troops marched into Amsterdam. My father's long-held nightmare was finally coming true. The thunderous sound of boots pounding the cobblestones, which I had heard in my dreams a few nights before, was happening in real life right there in front of us. Louis and Daniel and I slipped out of the apartment and made our way down the block to the corner. Hiding behind a few cars, we saw a large parade of soldiers and tanks moving along the main thoroughfare of our neighborhood. My heart was pounding a mile a minute in my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off those big men dressed perfectly alike and marching with a supreme confidence, as if our streets were meant for them and their shiny boots. I wanted to scream at them, but I was too scared to make a sound. Louis looked so angry I was afraid he wouldn't be able to control himself. Daniel kept his hands over our mouths. After a few minutes, we crept back into our building, each of us shaking from what we had witnessed. That morning, I knew that life as I had known it up until then was effectively over for my entire family and me. And it was. Indeed, it was. From then on, bit by bit, as it was in every country the Nazis occupied, their rights, their freedoms were stripped away. It wasn't long before boys and girls could not ride bicycles around the streets. It wasn't long before Jews were prohibited from riding on the streetcars, the trams, and on buses. It wasn't long before they were wearing yellow stars, where the Jewish theater was closed, where the opera and the symphony were closed. And bit by bit, they were squeezed and squeezed and squeezed more into what essentially became a ghetto in Amsterdam, as it was in so many other cities around Europe. And so this was the life that Solomon Kuhl knew as a boy becoming a man, so to speak, in the tradition of the bar mitzvah. So this was his adolescence. This marked him for life in his inner life, who he was becoming as a young man. And day by day, as things changed, also there was risk involved for his older brothers, his sister, and his mother and father. And one by one, they disappeared without any explanation, because that's just not how things worked, of course. So there were rumors, there were musings about whether Daniel, the oldest of the brothers, was a member of the resistance. And we don't know still whether that was ever really true. But he's the first one who disappeared, and then Louis and Tinny, they were gone. And then finally, his father was taken away. And so Saul was left with his mother and with his aunt living in the apartment, even as many, many Jewish households were basically all disappearing. But for some reason, they don't really know, they had not been touched. The three of them were still there. Until one day, when Saul's mother, as they knew things were closing in, they knew it was inevitable, they knew it was kind of any minute, but they were trying to pretend that it wasn't any minute, because you can't really live too deeply on the edge of that trauma and subsist. So they asked Saul's mother and his aunt, they were asking him to play the cello. Saul had been studying cello since he was much younger. And so they wanted to have a little distraction, so they're asking him to play. And let me pick up another chapter from that moment. My father's aunt slept comfortably in her easy chair. She was alone now that her children and grandchildren had disappeared. There was no one left to take care of her, so my mother had invited her to live with us. Most of the time, she sat in the living room and knitted and napped. Every day I woke up, I thought it might be the day that Daniel or Louis or Tinny would return home, or my father. If just one of them showed up, it had to mean the others were not far behind. I carried this dream with me all day, every day. Sal, play, practice, practice, practice. That's all I had heard since I was 8 years old. Both of my parents always encouraged me to play the cello, but it was my mother and Mr. Lentz who had pushed me to practice every day. Now I was trying to force myself to learn a new etude when it was the furthest thing from my mind. I was trying to please my mother, though, who needed any diversion I could provide to take her mind off our terrible situation. We were both trying to maintain our belief that the war would soon be over and that everyone would return home. Even though they'd been gone for months already, we had no idea where any of them were. Everyone we knew offered up ideas. They might still be in the Westerbork transit camp in the Netherlands. They might be in a work camp in Germany. They might have been sent on one of the weekly trains to the concentration camps in Auschwitz, far away in Poland. Or maybe they were in hiding somewhere inside the Netherlands. I wondered if Daniel was working with the Dutch resistance. Ever since that night at the kitchen table, when he said nothing and sat still, biting his lip, listening to our father's crazy idea of family suicide, I wondered about the possibility of Daniel having a secret life, so secret that he wasn't even allowed to tell his own family. Daniel had spoken so strongly about fighting the Nazis, as if he might have already done so in some shape or form. I thought he might have gone underground and was staying there somewhere inside the country. Whether it was Amsterdam or some other place, I had no idea, but I liked the notion of my big brother secretly fighting the Nazis and returning home a hero. Sal, what are you waiting for? Mama interrupted my romantic ideas about Daniel and the resistance fighters. I wanted to ask her about where Daniel might be, and Louis and Tinny, and of course my father, but she and I had some unknown, unwritten agreement that we wouldn't discuss such matters openly, as if talking about them might jinx the luck they would need to return home safe and sound. Although I knew it was a ridiculous superstition, I had to respect it. Mama was suffering terribly, having possibly lost her husband and 3 of her children. The radio reports from London talked about Jews being gassed in concentration camps, and there was a chance that my brothers, my sister, and my father could be among the thousands of people Hitler was sending to those camps. Perhaps if we didn't talk about it, it simply wouldn't happen. I slid my bow across the strings, trying to create some noise to take my mind away from the things I couldn't comprehend. There, you hear that, Mama? I hope she would be pleased. It's the etude you like. She turned her head in my direction, but her eyes were looking straight through me, staring someplace else. I had never seen her face like that before, and it frightened me. Mama, what is it? I rested the bow over my leg. Mama was concentrating on another sound. Suddenly her head snapped toward the window and she froze. Seemingly unable to stand up and move, she motioned for me to be quiet. Instead of standing up to go to the window, she crawled across the floor and opened the window a crack for me to listen. I could hear soldiers marching, lots of them, their heads, their heels clicking on the wet pavement like a perfect machine advancing up our street. Crouching down on my knees, I could hear their unmistakable voices barking out commands in loud, coarse German. It was the sound every Jew in Amsterdam dreaded hearing, especially marching toward their apartment building. It could only mean one thing, and we both knew it. Our eyes met, digesting what was about to happen. Sal, go upstairs right now, go and hide. I was paralyzed with fear and wasn't ready to leave my mother. My body tensed up as if the attack I knew was coming. It was a futile idea to imagine, even for a second. What could I possibly do against an entire squadron of German soldiers? Go! I could trick them. For a second, I thought I could seal the front door so the Germans would think the house had been cleared out. We could hide in our home until the war ended and my father, brothers, and sisters all returned. Mama, I can't. You must. I can't leave you. Sal, go upstairs right now and hide. We can both hide. Come on. I pleaded with her not to separate. No, Sal, I can't. I can't do that. Mama, please, your Aunt Rose, what shall I do with her? We both knew there was no suitable answer. The Nazis know, believe me, they know we are here. My mother tugged at my arm, pulling me away from the window. I glanced outside. 5 trucks filled with German SS soldiers and the Dutch black police had screeched to a halt outside our building. My chest was pounding faster and faster. The hammering of the boots and the menacing voices became louder. I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my mother's hand. The boots were coming closer, those terrible black boots, which I could never shake out of my mind. The soldiers' voices grew louder as they entered our building. There was only one family living on the ground floor apartment, and they were not Jewish. The other family on the second floor had disappeared weeks ago in the middle of the night. Sal, go. Mama took my hand and forcefully separated it from hers. In mere minutes, the police would march up the stairs and pound on our door. She kissed my hand. My mind froze. She motioned sharply toward the stairs. Now! A look of anger and pain and love and fear washed over her face all at once. Go. I knew this was my last chance. My mother kissed my hand and touched me on my cheek. I stared at her for another second, taking a photo of her face for safekeeping in my mind. I didn't know how I could leave her there. We heard soldiers slamming doors on the ground floor. Mama pointed down at my shoes. I removed them and looked back at her, unsure if I could make myself get up. Go! We heard the police yelling at the foot of our stairs. I was too scared to feel anything as the boots started slamming up the steps. I darted past my mother in my stocking feet, carrying a shoe in each hand. I ran out of our living room as quietly as I could and tiptoed up to the 4th floor. As I opened the door to my bedroom, I heard the vicious pounding of the Nazi soldiers ready to invade our apartment. Upstairs, I found the only hiding place I could, behind the door, in a curved niche in the wall where I usually hung my jacket. As I flattened myself into the hollow corner, I pulled the door open so that it closed me into my hiding place. I stood there shaking behind the door, not knowing what would happen next. Well, that was the moment, that was the turning point when Saul's mother and aunt were taken away by the Germans and vanished, simply in a moment. Now, this is where the luck, if you will, began for Saul. When the Germans came up the stairs, as he was trying to control his breathing behind the door, and they saw a mouse. And then Saul heard gunshots. And the German soldiers had shot the mouse. They were laughing and laughing and laughing. They thought it was the funniest thing they could. That was enough for them. They went back downstairs. They didn't even bother to check behind the door where he was standing, shaking. Luckily, the German soldiers had made enough noise of their own that they didn't hear him breathing. And moments later, when he knew it was quiet, and he scurried to the window, and he looked out the window and saw his mother and his aunt being taken away in a truck. And that's where it began, when Saul was literally and figuratively, in every way you want to slice it, he was alone. A teenager, a young and small one at that. And physically, what ended up saving him in the ensuing weeks and months was his physical size. Saul was on the small side. It reminded of me when I was bar mitzvah. I was such a little fisher, and I hadn't hit any puberty yet. And Saul was basically the same thing. He was really, really, small for his size. And when he was eventually taken, after hustling around the city and staying one night here with a cousin, a distant cousin. Another night he slept underneath the desk in the office of his school gymnastics coach. But none of them could keep him there. None of them could keep a Jewish kid wandering around the streets of Amsterdam, because they and their families would have been in terrible jeopardy. So he ended up on his 16th birthday in the home where he was staying. The German police tracked him down. And he was taken to the Jewish theater, the deportation center, as I had referred to. And because he was so small, he was able to be taken away to the creche, which was basically a children's center across the street from the Jewish theater. This is where babies and little children were kept. And because he was so little, he could pass for a child, way, way under 16. And this was done by a man named Walter Susskind, a German Jew who ended up saving hundreds of lives of Dutch children in Amsterdam. And there's a great documentary about him. Let me just see, I have it here. I'll just kind of hold it up on the screen. I don't know if you can see this here. This is called Secret Courage, the Walter Susskind story. And Walter interviewed Saul in the Jewish theater and got him to go to safekeeping in the creche across the street. And that's where he stayed off and on over the next many, many months. He tried to escape several times and couldn't, had to go back into the safety of that place where the nurses could hide him and disguise him and keep the German soldiers who were checking at bay. Finally, though, it was untenable and he couldn't, because all the Jews were deported from Amsterdam. The babies, the little children, they were taken away and the creche was closing. And one night, Saul, as he watched the trams and timed the trams, the streetcars going back and forth, the German soldiers on the other side of the street, and there were gaps. When the train would pull in, when the tram car would stop, the German soldiers couldn't see through. And that was his moment to get out the front door, run down the street and around the corner and disappear down an alley. And that's exactly what he did, until he finally was taken in by Jewish resistance fighters who brought him outside of Amsterdam into the safe houses where he stayed for the duration of the war, and a few different ones. I'm making a long story short, obviously, because we're not going to be here until next Tuesday. And he ended up staying with different Christian families who really put their own lives and the lives of their families at very, very high risk. And this is also another point that I think the book makes, and I wanted to make sure it was real clear without announcing it, to let it speak for itself, how young people can learn that even in the venality and the horror of the Holocaust, there are a lot of good things happening that can remind us and give us hope for humanity, that there were families who extended their welcome to a person in need like this, and put their own lives at risk, not just of themselves and their family, but their neighbors, their whole community, their churches, everyone. And they did this, and Saul was the lucky recipient of this love and support for quite a long time. This wasn't just for like a day or two. This was for months. And finally, when the war was truly over, after many, many close calls that are reflected in the book, Saul was able to return to Amsterdam. And just want to check the time here, so we're gonna have to jump ahead. So when Saul returned to Amsterdam, just give me 1 second here to catch up to myself. I'll pick up here at the very end. On September 5th, 1945, I returned to Amsterdam. By the time our bus reached the outer ring of the city, most of the children were asleep, as Saul was on a bus with young children. But I was restless and wide awake. I had no one who might be there to greet the bus, and I had no idea if anyone I knew was on it. Would anyone from my family be back yet? Could they have found each other and now come to find me? These thoughts rushed through my mind so I could barely sit still. I don't know where I'll sleep tonight. No one noticed me muttering to myself, what if they don't come back? What will I do? I felt an overwhelming, overpowering sense of disbelief just considering that possibility. 5 people just can't be erased off the earth. I knew they were on the way. If not today, they'll be back soon. When a Red Cross volunteer asked me to help wake the children, it came as a welcome distraction, helping me to forget my own anxieties. In a few minutes, we would be at the Portuguese synagogue. No, I'm sorry, the Portuguese hospital, which was used as a meeting point, a place for what everyone hoped would become the scene of joyous family reunions. Just wait, a volunteer said. Someone will be there for you. Everything will work out. I nodded in agreement, half of me believing it was true, while the other half tried to convince me that everything would work out. You're right, it'll be fine. I didn't trust my own voice, but I was full of hope nevertheless. A crowd of adults gathered there, looking anxiously to see their children step off the bus and into their open arms. I watched many children reunite with their loved ones, some mothers, a few fathers, but mostly older siblings and cousins. I heard so many asking for their parents. I couldn't imagine what they were being told. At first, I was happy to see everyone come together, but I couldn't help thinking of myself and finding my own family. I searched through the crowd, asking everyone I could. I didn't find anyone who knew my parents, let alone had any news of them. The Red Cross couldn't offer any suggestions. The crowd began to thin. I remember how lost I felt in a large city like Amsterdam. So many Jews had once lived there, but I didn't know many of them. Now no one wanted to hear about what I'd suffered. Everyone had terrible things to tell, and who wanted to think of them anymore? I stood alone in the middle of the street. Even though I was back on my own turf, the anxiety and fear I had felt hiding from the Germans took hold once again. I had no idea what to do, but I knew I had to move. Nothing would come from standing still. Perhaps if I kept moving, I'd run into someone I knew. As I walked toward my old neighborhood, I passed a few familiar landmarks. The Jewish theater looked so deserted. I felt as if the months I'd spent there existed in another lifetime, and I had no desire to revisit what offered me absolutely nothing. I noticed an old familiar shop nearby. It appeared to have been shut down long ago, yet I could see a name etched into a pane of glass, still intact on the front door. The shop had once been Coco's ice cream parlor, and I thought of its former owner, Ernst Kahn, and how he had been brutally murdered. As I peered inside, I thought I caught a glimpse of my father. It was my own reflection in the glass door, a young man now, taller than I'd been the last time I stood there. I looked relatively young, between a boy and a man. I saw a face full of fear and uncertainty. The war shattered everything I thought my life would become. After all the years of instability and uncertainty, I wasn't sure how I could put it back together. At that moment, alone in Amsterdam, with no idea what would happen, I knew I had to stop thinking about the past. My only option was to move on and make something new. I had to start right away as I walked toward my old neighborhood. I am a survivor, and I am going home. I am going home to find my family. Well, this is how the story ends. And in a short epilogue, I reveal to the readers what actually happened. Saul moved in with a distant cousin. He ended up in the army, going to the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. He joined the Jewish War Orphans organization, but they did very little to help him. And back in Amsterdam, he joined a survivors group called the Magen David Club, and that's where he met the woman who would become his wife, who was also saved by Walter Susskind. And for years, Saul tried to find information about his parents. Eventually, he found through Red Cross records that his brother Louis had died in Auschwitz, his father Philip died in Auschwitz, his mother Rachel and his sister Tinny died in Sobibor, and his brother Daniel also died in Auschwitz. And for the remainder of his life, certainly in the time that I knew him, he was still haunted by these memories of his family and this survivor's guilt that he spoke about so intensely during the time that I met him. And so, as Sal is quoted in this documentary about Walter Susskind called Secret Courage, this is how Saul said, he summed it up. You will come over it, but you never forget it. You live with it, and you go dying with it, and you never forget. And so that's the story in an abbreviated form of The Boy Behind the Door, how Solomon Kuhl escaped the Nazis.
I'm just going to have to say, wow. It was your storytelling is just superb, David. And I think everyone in the audience is spellbound by the way you can tell a story. It's a tragic story, but it makes you feel like you're right there as you tell it. So I really want to honor you with just an amazing presentation. It was terrific. I'm sure as you read through the chats, you will be able to see how our audience has enjoyed your presentation. Same with you, Marc, and same with you, Judith. Judith, I'm going to hold off on the song because I really do think it's appropriate that we go into the chat, into the Q&A, and I want to open the mic up to anyone who wants to ask our guests, all three of them, any questions about their backgrounds, their stories, I would appreciate if you could get on camera and you can unmute yourself. I would love for you to either raise your hand or to use the reactions button like I'm doing right now, is to raise a hand so I can see you and offer you the floor. So is anybody interested in asking our guests a question? So you can unmute yourself and just talk away. I also want to acknowledge Peter Kupfer. If you can raise your hand there, Peter. Peter has also written a book, which is launching in November, called The Glassmaker's Son. It's right there. And he also has the Amsterdam Press, so you have some connection to David. You're both being published by the same author, which is
Yeah.
and so that's exciting. And so is there anybody who would like to start off with a question? Ruth, Ruth is a longtime friend and survivor from Vienna as a child. And you usually have something to add. So anything? You have to unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
Can't hear you.
I'd like to, where did he go? Oh, there you are, David. I'd like to ask if any of the people that you know belong to the International Group of Child Survivors. That's a story that would certainly fit into that category.
No, not. I certainly have heard of this group, but nothing along this journey has brought me to it specifically. I don't know if the publisher is doing that on her own, but I don't have any direct connection, but I would certainly be happy to. I'd welcome that. Yeah.
So I'm going to take the follow-up and lead. I know, Ruth, you've just returned with your daughters from the conference. Why don't you give us a brief summary of what you tell us about the conference, tell us about what you enjoy about going to the conference, and was there anything remarkable at this week's conference?
I went the first time about 30, almost 40 years ago when they first started. And we were children, most of us. Yeah, we were all, this is people now in their 80s and 90s. And we were children and we survived. And our parents kept telling us, you were just kids, you were little children, you don't know anything. But it turns out that we did. And for me, as an only child, and many of us are only children, it was like having, at that time, about 300 brothers and sisters, people who could validate and corroborate how I felt. No one else in the whole world understood us except ourselves and what we had been through. And many of us had been through some really horrifying experiences. Some of us had been saved some of that problem, mostly by Gentile people. Right. And we told each other stories. And I just was trying to write you now, Jeffrey, about what I actually found out this year. Every year I found out new things. This year, the epiphany came to me as I listened to other survivors tell their stories. We were saved almost exclusively, all of us that we talked to, maybe 20, 30 people this year, but I mean, there were hundreds there, but there are a lot of second generation now. So that's good. And we're the actual survivors aren't really that many. But the thing I learned and will always remember from this conference is that we were saved by our mothers. The brave and, well, the courage, the fortitude, the foresight, the intelligence, the quick wits that we heard about these women, they saved their children. It was almost entirely, that whole conference was about our mothers and how they saved us. And we need to keep that in mind, that it was the women that probably saved the majority of people that did survive. The other thing I learned in Missouri, well, St. Louis now has a new just opened Holocaust Museum.
Mhm.
And it's a state of the art, and it was worth the trip just to go see that from, well, I came from Portland to St. Louis. That's a long trip for me. They had a big TV screen with a class of about 20 boys, and maybe some of you have seen this before, but I have not. And as you're watching it, each child begins to fade out until just one child is left. And after all these years, it came to me all of a sudden, I was the only child left in our family. My parents always referred to me as the child. They hardly ever, when they spoke to each other about me, they didn't use my name that much. It was the child. And that was because I was the only child left of maybe a dozen or more of my cousins that were all probably 7, 8 years old when they were murdered. And as you indicated, the Red Cross had very good records. So we know that they died they didn't just die in Terezin, they were murdered in Auschwitz. And so were most of the other cousins, that some of them just disappeared until we found 50, 60 years later, we found out what happened to them. So anyway, this particular conference was very meaningful for me, because it taught me a few things that I should have thought about before, but every time I've gone, I have learned new things and also seen a new city. Just a short sentence here, St. Louis is a very beautiful place with not just the arch, but the nice wide streets and beautiful old buildings, and it was worth the visit. And thanks for giving me the time, Jeffrey.
Well, I also want to share that we have Ruth's daughter, Diana, with us, and if you can raise your hand. So I would love for you to, I know you were on the trip as well, because your mom told me that both daughters went with her. So maybe you can contribute a little bit about, from a second generation's perspective, what you came and got out of the conference. Nice to see you.
I echo what she said too about the museum. I always learn something new. I get to see old friends that I met at my first conference about 10 or 15 years ago. This one was special because there was only 55 second generation, whereas the last conference I was at was 150.
Oh.
But it was a West Coast one, so there were a lot more people on the West Coast, I guess. I'm not sure why they didn't come, but also I believe we had 6 third generation, which we haven't had that many before. So it's an inspiration that come Washington, DC, we're hoping that there'll be more people there, especially since we'll be able to go through the museum as well.
That's great. And I want to also acknowledge my friend Ben. Wave your hand there, Ben, and if you can unmute yourself. Ben is another survivor. He was in more than 6 concentration camps. He presented to our group also his story. So I was wondering what the story that either Marc told or David told impacted you, Ben.
It couldn't impact me because I don't live with it. I don't live with the past anymore. I live in the future, and it tells me to live a regular life. I speak still to schools. I even spoke to a college not a long time ago, and I even went to a lot of places, to schools and to the army, and that's released me from the suffering that I've been through. So I would acknowledge this forever went through the same thing what I did. Only some people live with it. Like my brother-in-law died of age 55. He couldn't shake the past, and because he couldn't forget his 11 brothers and sisters died, and he is alive, so he died of age 55. So you see, by my thinking, I let my family feel better, and me live longer by thinking how to get better and not to drill on it.
Well,
I
I
would
want to,
like to, I hear all the stories and I understand what happened. And the same, a lot of things happened with me, even in the camps. Only if I start thinking every day about that, the life would be completely different. And that's why I do whatever I do.
well, I'm glad that you continue to bless us with your presence. And I want to acknowledge that Ben has celebrated his 94th birthday, I think in July or August. It was terrific. So Devorah, I know you're a survivor as well. So I'm going to not put you on the spot, but I wanted to know if how the stories that you heard today impacted your life. You have to unmute yourself, please.
Well, I think it's very important that we do tell our stories. And this whole question of survivor guilt and of turning the stories actually into love stories where we celebrate the people that we're remembering seems very important. So I very much.
Tell us about the presentation that you just gave about your grandparents. My sister mentioned it to me. And why don't you share this with our family here?
So last Thursday, I gave myself an 80th birthday present by presenting a 40-minute conversation with the past. I started with the love story of Ida and Fritz from 1896. And their life, their love, their legacy have been very, very important to me, to my growing up years, even though, of course, I never met them. But they were like within me. I would love to share the link when it comes. There will be a link to the talk.
Okay. You just send it to me. I'll take care of it.
It was, I didn't think I could tell this story without crying. But because who knows, I turned it into a love story between them. So I was focusing on the power of love that came through the generations. So I was taking this idea, well, of generational trauma and turning it into, so yes, generational trauma, but also generational love. And through that, I was able to get the courage to tell the story through my own lens.
Well, I'm honored that you were able to do that, and I'm hoping that it gave you took some pressure off your weight off your shoulders to be able to tell that story. And I think it's really important that you did. And I want to acknowledge Gary and Tony. You've come to several of our programs. I have never met you personally, so I want to welcome you and say hello to you. If you can unmute yourself, and perhaps you can share your background with us and what these programs mean to you. Still not hearing you. Talk to, now you're muted again. There you go. Just say something, see if we can hear you. No, unfortunately not. Okay, well, we'll try to get you back. Unfortunately, we're not able to hear you. Okay, so I want to since there are no other, I just want to make sure there are no other questions for our presenters. And if not, I want to sort of take the next few minutes to tell you that our program is, the next program we have is on, hold on one second. It's on December 11th, Sunday, December 11th. The two authors who are going to be presenting are Peter Kupfer in his book, The Glassmaker's Son, and also Jack Fried in his book, Hairs of Auschwitz, which is a very emotional story that Jack has to tell us. Also, we have Noah Aronson as our musical guest. I also want to make you all aware of the fact that we do have some new properties. I'll put them in the chat for you to be able to tour and explore. I'm not sure who's having that background noise, so let me just try to fix it.
Gary and Tony.
Okay, I'll take it.
Background noise.
There we go.
Okay, yeah.
All right, so on December 15th, we hope you can come back. I want to give the last
December 11th or the 15th?
15th, December 15th. Sorry if I misspoke.
It's at 11th, so yeah.
Yeah, December 15th. You'll be
Still is
seeing,
the middle of the
obviously,
week. It's on
you'll
a
be seeing
Thursday.
announcements. What's that?
Excuse me, Jeffrey, it's December 15 is a Thursday. I think you mean
All right.
11.
Yeah, maybe I'm wrong. Hold on a minute. Give me a minute. I'm working too quickly here. December 11th is a
Yeah.
Sunday?
Yes.
Yes, December 11th. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Take that.
And so the next song, Judith, who is ready to be queued up, and let us know a little bit about why you chose this song.
Okay, this song was commissioned by the International Gathering of Descendants of the Shoah. And the chairman asked me, he said he wanted a song, an anthem that would be like commitment for children and adults, but especially for young people, children, to sing this song like at Yom HaShoah, but also even at a bar mitzvah or, you know, someplace. And I think it would be actually very appropriate for your group, the child survivors, for them to have access to it. Well, it's on YouTube, so they have access. And if they would like to learn, anyone would like to learn it, or even to have people sing it, that would be the best if they would sing it together. I'm going to play it for you now, and you'll see how you feel about it. Let's see. Let me close this. Okay. It's called Legacy. And there's a very lovely video also on YouTube that goes along with it, that it's nice pictures and
And here I stand, I am your legacy within my heart. Our martyrs so close to me, I pledge to honor you. I pledge to sanctify your memory, and I will always be. I am your legacy. Israel, you showed us God's light to set us free. Your heritage is always a part of me. I pledge to honor you. I pledge to sanctify your memory, and I will always be. I am your legacy. We are your legacy.
Very beautiful, and what a way to exit this beautiful program with Marc and David and you, Judith, and all of you who are coming to contribute your own personal stories. The program is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel tomorrow. It is also now being part of a project that I've been building called the JCHRnow Museum, which takes all of our programs and places it into exhibitions and collections as if it would be a Jewish digital museum. I've put those addresses on both new platforms in chat for you to be able to see it. And I want to thank you so much. It's an honor for me to bring these programs to us, to record history of our parents, of our own stories, and have them last digitally forever. So thank you again. We'll see you next month, and I'll be in touch. Take care now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.